There is a particular kind of man who has survived everything by feeling nothing, who built his whole life around the discipline of not wanting what he couldn't control. Merrick Nixon was that man. He had been that man for a very long time. And then Veda Townsend walked into his kitchen, barefoot, humming something she couldn't name, and every carefully constructed wall he had spent years reinforcing developed a crack he couldn't locate and couldn't fix. She didn't know that. She was too busy convincing herself the whole thing was in her head, that a man like him didn't look at women like her with any kind of intention. She had been burned before. She knew what projection felt like. What she didn't know was that on the other side of that apartment, in the quiet of his own room, he was fighting something he hadn't felt in years. Something that didn't have a place in his world. Something that had her name on it. Part 2 picks up exactly where the tension left off. And this time, the walls between them are going to get a lot harder to maintain. If you're new here, subscribe and drop a like before we begin. Tell me in the comments, are you team just admit it already? Or are you enjoying the slow burn? Now let's get back to them. December came in cold and certain, the way December always does in New York. Like it had been waiting just off stage and finally decided the city had been warm enough for long enough. The first real snow fell on a Wednesday, and Lena pressed her face against the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room with both palms flat on the glass and announced that the sky was finally doing something interesting. Veda stood behind her with a mug of coffee and felt something loosen in her chest at the image. This small, serious girl and the white city beyond the glass, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel how much she had come to love this life that wasn't technically hers. That was the complicated part. Not Merrick, not the tension she was managing with reasonable success, not the careful, professional distance she maintained during daylight hours. The complicated part was how deeply she had settled into all of it. Lena's routines, the apartment's rhythms, the particular smell of the place in the morning, coffee, and something faintly cedar that she had stopped pretending wasn't him. She had stopped pretending about a number of small things, privately, in the hours when honesty was easier to bear. What she had not stopped doing was keeping it contained. Merrick had been different since the hallway, not distant. That would have been easier, actually, something with a clean, emotional logic she could follow. He was simply more deliberate, like a man who had identified a variable in his life and decided to manage it carefully rather than eliminate it. He said good morning now, every morning, with the specific quality of attention that meant he had already assessed how she looked before she'd had the chance to compose herself. He asked Lena questions at dinner that somehow always created space for Veda to answer too. He held doors, not with performance, but with the quiet, automatic courtesy of a man who had decided she was worth the gesture and wasn't going to make a production of it. It was, Veda thought, the most controlled form of interest she had ever encountered. And it was working on her in ways that a more obvious approach never could have. That Wednesday evening, with the snow still falling outside and Lena asleep with unusual ease, Veda was in the kitchen making tea when Merrick appeared in the doorway, still in his coat, just returned from whatever his evenings sometimes contained that he never explained and she never asked about. He looked tired in a way he rarely allowed. Not physically, he carried himself the same regardless, but around the eyes, something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a man who had been performing certainty for too many hours. "Long night?" she asked. It came out more gently than she intended. He looked at her for a moment. Longer than most. He didn't move to leave. She turned back to the kettle and made a decision that was small and irreversible at the same time. She took a second mug from the cabinet, set it on the counter beside hers, said nothing. She heard him set his keys down, heard him shrug off his coat, and then he was standing beside her at the counter, close, not touching, the warmth of him arriving before he did. And he picked up the second mug without comment, like it had always been there waiting for him. They stood together at the kitchen window and watched the snow come down over the city in silence that felt, for the first time, like something chosen rather than something managed. His shoulder was an inch from hers. Neither of them moved away. The snow stayed for 3 days. The city slowed the way it only does under a real accumulation. Quieter streets, muffled sounds, the particular quality of light that bounces off white and makes everything feel slightly suspended in time. Inside the apartment on the 43rd floor, the effect was amplified. Lena declared it a blanket and books situation, and Veda did not argue. Merrick, unexpectedly, worked from home. That was new. He set up at the dining table instead of his office, close enough to the living room that the sounds of Lena's afternoon found him easily, far enough that he maintained the appearance of professional separation. Veda was aware of him the entire day in the way you're aware of a fire in a room, not looking directly at it, but always knowing exactly where it is. By the second snow day, the apartment had taken on a different quality entirely. The boundaries that existed in ordinary life, his world, her role, the careful architecture of their arrangement, felt slightly less fixed under the weight of all that weather. It was Lena who broke the careful choreography, the way children do, without malice or strategy. She had a fever by Thursday evening. Not alarming, 101, the ordinary kind that arrives with winter and requires nothing dramatic, just water and rest and someone nearby. But it changed the texture of the night entirely. Veda sat with her through the early evening, cool cloth, quiet voice, the particular patience that came naturally to her with Lena. Merrick appeared at 8, having apparently decided that the report he'd been reviewing could wait indefinitely. He sat on the edge of Lena's bed and put his hand on her forehead with a gentleness that was so unguarded, so completely unperformed, that Veda had to look away for a moment. There was something about watching a powerful man be tender with his child that undid certain carefully maintained positions. They stayed, both of them, without discussing it, Veda in the armchair, Merrick on the small ottoman he'd pulled from the corner, the lamp on its lowest setting, and Lena drifting in and out of light sleep between them. They talked quietly when she slept, not about anything weighted. Lena's most recent observations about the nature of clouds, a book Veda had mentioned weeks ago that he had apparently read and had thoughts about. The way New York snow was different from snow anywhere else in a way that was hard to articulate, but instantly recognizable. It was easy. That was the thing that kept striking Veda, how completely, dangerously easy it was. At some point past midnight, Lena's breathing settled into the deep, even rhythm of real sleep. The fever had softened. The room was very quiet. Veda looked up from the chair and found Merrick already watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Unguarded, in a way that the kitchen and the hallway and all the careful evenings had never quite managed to produce. Raw, almost. Like a man who had stopped, just for this hour, performing the version of himself that kept everything at a safe distance. "She's okay," Veda said softly. "I know," he said, but he wasn't looking at Lena. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It had weight and direction. It leaned. Veda felt it pressing against something inside her chest that she had been guarding for months, and for the first time, she wasn't entirely sure the guard was going to hold. They moved to the hallway together without speaking, pulled by the same unspoken agreement that Lena's sleep was something neither of them wanted to disturb. The apartment was completely still around them, the snow outside muffling the city, the lamp in Lena's room casting a thin line of gold under the door. Everything else dark and close. Merrick leaned against the hallway wall, and Veda stood a few feet away. And for a moment, neither of them seemed to know quite what to do with the absence of the child between them as a natural reason for being in the same space. "You should sleep," he said. It was the reasonable thing to say. "So should you," she said back. Neither of them moved. He looked at her in the dark hallway, with that quality of attention she had spent months learning to absorb without reacting to. And then he said, "You're good with her. With Lena. It doesn't feel like a job when you do it." Veda felt the words land somewhere unguarded. "She makes it easy." "She doesn't, actually. She made the last 3 people quit." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the closest architecture to one. "She told me," Veda said. She was very matter-of-fact about it. "She likes you." A pause. "I've noticed." The way he said it carried something underneath it that he didn't elaborate on, and Veda's pulse did something she chose not to examine. She was standing close enough now that she could see the tiredness around his eyes clearly, the loosened collar, the version of him that existed only after midnight, when the performance of certainty had finally clocked out. This was the part of him she found most difficult to be rational about. Not the power, not the way he filled a room. She had managed those. It was this, the man underneath the architecture. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. It was a small gesture, unhurried, almost absent. The kind of thing you do when your hand has already made the decision before your mind catches up. His fingers barely grazed her cheek, but the touch moved through her like a current, slow and total. And she went very still, the way you go still when something important is happening, and you don't want to be the one who breaks it. His hand didn't pull back immediately. It rested at the side of her face for just a moment, warm, certain, with none of the hesitation that had defined every almost between them until now. His eyes were on hers, and they were very dark and very close, and entirely unambiguous for the first time since she had walked through his door. "Veda," he said. Just her name, but the way he said it in that hallway, low and quiet, with the snow outside and his daughter asleep behind the door, and months of carefully managed distance finally giving way. It was not the way an employer said a name. It was the way a man says the name of someone he has been trying not to want for a very long time. She didn't answer with words. She closed the remaining distance between them, and he met her without hesitation. And the kiss was nothing like the restrained, careful version of themselves they had both been performing for months. It was quiet and deep, and it tasted like everything that had been waiting just below the surface of every shared silence, every almost touch, every good night said in the dark. When they finally parted, his forehead rested against hers. His hand was still at her face. Outside, the snow kept falling over the city, indifferent and perfect, covering everything. The morning after arrived the way mornings do after something irreversible, with complete indifference to what had changed. The city was still white outside the windows. Lena's fever had broken overnight. The coffee maker started at 7, the way it always did. And Veda stood in her room at 6:58, looking at her own reflection with the specific expression of a woman trying to take inventory of something she wasn't sure she could afford. She had kissed him. He had kissed her back with the focused certainty of a man who had been waiting to do exactly that for longer than she had any business knowing. And then they had stood in that hallway for another moment, foreheads together, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with an unhurried tenderness that had undone her more thoroughly than the kiss itself. And then, because they were both adults, with a child asleep 10 feet away, and a reality that existed beyond that hallway, they had said goodnight. Properly, this time. With the full weight of what had just shifted between them sitting in the air, unnamed but entirely present. She had not slept well. Not because of regret, that would have been simpler. She hadn't slept because she felt too much, too clearly, and feeling things clearly had not historically served her well. She was in the kitchen when he appeared, dressed for the day with the kind of put-together precision that suggested he had also not slept particularly well, but was not going to let that be visible. He looked at her directly, which was the first thing. No adjustment period, no careful avoidance, just his eyes finding hers the moment he entered the room, like that was simply where they went now. "How's Lena?" "Fever's gone. She's still sleeping." He nodded, poured his coffee, and then he set the pot down and turned to face her with a directness that made the air in the room rearrange itself. "I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen," he said. His voice was even, but underneath it was something that hadn't been there before. Something open, which on Merrick Nixon looked almost startling. "I wasn't going to ask you to," she said carefully. "Good." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm also not going to tell you it was simple, or that I have a clean answer for what comes next. I don't. Neither do I. But I know what I want," he said. Quiet, certain. The way he said everything, except this time what he wanted was her, and they both understood it completely. Veda set her mug down. She had prepared herself, in the early hours of the morning, for several versions of this conversation. The version where he was professional and apologetic. The version where he put careful distance back between them, with the skill of a man who had built his life on managed boundaries. She had not fully prepared for this, for him standing in the morning light, slightly less armored than usual, telling her the truth without dressing it up. "I need you to understand something," she said. "My history with trusting the wrong person it's not abstract. I don't recover easily from that." "I know." "You don't, actually. Not the details." "Then tell me," he said, simply, like he had time and intended to use it, and wasn't going anywhere. Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas at that precise moment, hair chaotic, Gerald the giraffe hanging from one hand, announcing that she was hungry, and also that the snow was still there, and also that today needed to be a pancake day. The conversation folded itself away, incomplete. But Merrick's eyes found Veda's over Lena's head, and what was in them was patient and steady and entirely clear. This wasn't over. It was, in fact, just beginning. Pancakes happened. That was the thing about real life. It didn't pause for emotional reckonings. Lena sat at the kitchen island with flour on her nose within 4 minutes of waking up, issuing instructions about blueberries with the authority of someone who had strong opinions and no patience for improvisation. Veda made the batter. Merrick, in a development that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago, stood at the stove and managed the pan with the focused competence of a man who approached even pancakes like a problem worth solving correctly. Lena narrated the entire process. It was ordinary and warm and quietly extraordinary, and Veda felt it settle over her like something she didn't have a safe word for. After breakfast, Merrick left for the office, and life resumed its shape. But it was a different shape now, subtly, permanently altered, the way a room looks different after you've moved one piece of furniture. Everything in the same place, and yet, he texted her that afternoon. Not about Lena, not about logistics, just, "I meant what I said this morning." She stared at it for longer than was strictly necessary. then typed back, "I know." And then, because she was trying to be brave in small increments, "I meant what I said, too." The conversation that followed was not long, but it was honest in a way that felt new for both of them. Careful, real. Two people trying to build something with full awareness of what they both stood to lose. He didn't minimize his world or pretend it was uncomplicated. She didn't pretend her hesitation was fully resolved. What they agreed on, without using those exact words, was that they were both willing to find out. The week that followed was different in texture. Not dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no declarations performed for an audience. What changed was the small things, which turned out to be the only things that actually mattered. He brought her coffee to the sitting room without being asked, setting it beside her book, with a brief touch to her shoulder that lingered 2 seconds longer than casual. She stopped bracing herself when he entered a room. He smiled, actually smiled, full and unhurried, at something she said on Wednesday evening, and it rearranged his entire face into something that made her breath catch in a way she no longer bothered to explain away. They were careful around Lena, which felt right without needing discussion. Whatever this was, it belonged to the quiet hours, the spaces between. But Lena, who was 4 and therefore operating on pure instinct, looked between them one evening at dinner with her serious, dark eyes and said, with the devastating accuracy of small children, "You two are being different." Merrick looked at Veda. Veda looked at Merrick. "Different how?" Veda asked. Lena considered this with great seriousness. "Softer," she said finally, and went back to her food, as if she hadn't just diagnosed the entire situation in one word. That night, after Lena was asleep, Merrick found Veda at the window, her favorite place, he had learned, when she had something turning over in her mind. He stood beside her and didn't ask what she was thinking, which was exactly right. After a moment, she said, "The agency called today." She felt him go still beside her. "There's a placement in Chicago. They wanted to know if I was still available." The city glittered below them in the cold December dark. She hadn't looked at him yet. She was waiting to see what the silence would say. She still hadn't looked at him. That was the tell. Merrick knew it the way he knew everything about her by now, which was thoroughly and without having planned to. Veda looked at things directly when she had already made peace with them. When she was still deciding, she looked away. She was looking at the city, which meant she hadn't decided, which meant Chicago was not a done thing, which meant she was standing at his window waiting for something from him, even if she would never have used those words. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes at midnight in December, when you've run out of reasons to protect yourself, that this was the moment. Not a moment for careful management or strategic distance, or the version of himself that kept everything at arm's length, because arm's length had kept him functional for years. This was the moment for the truth, simply said. "Don't go," he said. She turned then, finally. Her eyes found his in the dark, and they were wide and very still, the way they got when something had landed that she hadn't fully prepared for. "Merrick, I'm not saying it as your employer." He held her gaze. "I'm aware of what I'm saying, and I'm saying it anyway. Don't go to Chicago." The city hummed 43 floors below them. Veda looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, which almost never happened. He could read rooms, read people, read the temperature of a negotiation before a word was spoken. But she had always been slightly beyond his fluency, which was one of the things, he now understood, that had undone him completely. "I wasn't sure you'd say that," she said finally. Her voice was quiet. "I know. I thought maybe I was reading into things." "You weren't." He took a step toward her, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to make the intention clear, because she deserved intention made clear. I've been trying to talk myself out of this since the second day you were here. I saved your name in my phone as a reminder to keep my distance. Something moved across her face. What did you save it as? He held her gaze. Don't. The word landed in the room with its full weight. Veda let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Not amused, but the kind of exhale that happens when something you've been carrying suddenly makes sense. That's the most you thing I've ever heard, she said. It didn't work, he said. Clearly. No. He was close now. Close enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to hold his eyes. It didn't work from the first morning. You crouched down to talk to Lena before you'd even taken your coat off. I was finished before I started. Veda looked at him. This man who ran empires and sat on floors and stood outside her door in the dark and saved her name as a warning he never once managed to follow. And she thought about Dana and Chicago and every careful argument she had built against this over months. And then she thought about how none of those arguments had ever once stopped her from hoping. The agency needs an answer by Monday, she said. I know, he said. Give me the weekend. She searched his face, found nothing there but certainty, and something else, something that looked, on Merrick Nixon, remarkably like hope. She nodded, once, slowly, and he reached up and tucked her hair back the way he had in the hallway. Except this time his hand stayed at her face, and this time, neither of them looked away. You just watched a man who has never asked for anything, ask. And she hasn't answered yet. If you felt that, drop a number from 1 to 10 below, because where this goes next is going to make that number change. Part 3 is coming, and something tells me you already know you're not going anywhere.